Cool. We are finishing lesson 4.1. The only thing we had left to talk about was an observational study versus an experiment. It might take a minute to kind of get those, but I believe once we do our 4 examples here that will make sense. So a sample survey usually aims to gather info about a population without disturbing the population. That's called an observational study. If you're trying to get info without disturbing the peace of what you're studying, that's an observational study. Some examples of that is just like watching the behavior of animals in the wild without actually going in and disturbing them, or just like tracking the medical history of human beings because you don't disturb them. But an experiment, I think we're pretty used to experiments. We do a lot of them in science classes also, is where you try to impose some sort of treatment to measure the response. Example, does aspirin reduce the chance of heart attack? Do plants grow better when classical music is playing? So you'd have like a treatment going. So let's go to the vocab on the very front page of 4.1. On an observational study, there's a couple of blanks in there. We can fill these in on the vocab. An observational study like measures the variables of interest but does not attempt to influence the responses. So I'm on the front side of the 4.1 worksheet, and we're up in the vocab boxes at the very top on observational study, 2 blanks. Observational studies does not attempt to influence the responses. They just watch it and see what happens, hence the word observational. An experiment deliberately imposes some sort of treatment to individuals, so you can fill that in. So there's our vocab. The bad thing is about these is it's a lot of reading. You know, it's like, holy cow, look at this stories going on. So let's see if it is an observational study or an experiment on 11 here. 90 residents of the retirement community were selected at random. Each member of the sample was asked a number of questions, including questions about exercise and blood pressure. Residents who exercise more often were less likely to have blood pressure. So they figured something out from what the question is, what did they do? Did they do an experiment or did they do an observational study? Did they make the old folks do anything, or did they just ask them questions and record their answers? Or did they make them exercise, or did they ask them questions about exercise? Yeah, if they just ask them questions and record that, that is an observational study. And then you can kind of abbreviate that if you want to, like OBS study. The reason why is there was no treatments. You can just literally write that. No treatments. That's how you know. The treatments are like, okay, we're setting up an experiment. No treatments whatsoever. It's always weird, our first one, too, to see if that was true or what it was. Let's see about this next one. Students in a stats class were divided into 2 groups. One group was given a set of words to memorize in a room with music playing. Students in the other group were given the same list of words to memorize, but in a quiet room. You see how they set up 2 scenarios there? They're supposed to study the same set of words. One time they got music, one time it's quiet. That's called a treatment, right? You know, they're treating students differently from one group to the other. That's why it's called a treatment. Did they treat them differently? So students in the quiet room were able to remember more words. What do you think? Observational study or experiment, since there was a treatment? That is an experiment, because there was a treatment. And I think the easy way to, like, understand what a treatment is like, did they treat everyone the same, or did they treat them differently? And would you believe on these ones, they treated the 2 groups differently, because one time they got music and one time they didn't get music. That's why that's an experiment. So let's read the next one. 60 4-year-old children were randomly divided into 3 groups. One group was shown fast-paced cartoon. One group was shown an educational cartoon, and the other group was given art supplies and instructed to draw pictures. Let's just stop right there. 3 groups. Did they treat them all the same, or did they treat them differently? Didn't they treat them differently, right? Totally treated them differently. So then they figured out something happened. They want to know, was that an observational study or an experiment? Bro, that's an experiment, because they treated them differently. They They treated them differently. And then the last guy. 100 teenagers between the ages of 16 and 18 were surveyed. The teens were asked whether, as young children, they watched fast-paced cartoons more often than, less often than, or about equally as often as educational cartoons. They were also asked to reveal their GPA. And then here's what they figured out after that, which has nothing to do with it. When they surveyed these 16 to 18-year-olds, did they treat them all the same? Didn't they ask the same questions, even if, like, they asked them all about what kind of cartoon they watched, right? They said, hey, did you do this less often, more often, or equal? And they also asked, what's your GPA? They treated everyone the same, right? So is that an observational study or an experiment? That's an observational study. Which, like I said, you can abbreviate OBS study, observational study, because there were no treatments. What do you think about those, distinguishing the two? Usually it gets more and more obvious the more we do. So last big question here is kind of ties all of section 4.1 together. We did it in two parts. The first is they want to know, like in this story here, what is the statistical question? I'm going to be nice and not make us write a bunch down, but let's read the story here. It says, researchers at Columbia University randomly selected 1,000 teenagers in the United States for a survey. According to an ABC News article about the research, teenagers who eat with their families at least 5 times a week are more likely to get better grades in school. So question 15 asks, what is the statistical question? Would you believe it has to do with this, right? Isn't that kind of like what they're studying in this situation? Like, so why don't you do this? Why don't you put the word "are" in front of it? And that's the whole statistical question. Instead of rewriting that whole thing down, like the real statistical question is, are teenagers who eat with their families at least 5 times a week more likely to get better grades in school? That's what they want to know. So there's the statistical question. So it's just like "are" is the word in front of there instead of writing it all down. Is it a valid statistical question? I know it's been since last class period since we totally talked about that, but a valid statistical question is will have results that vary. So what do you think? When they surveyed those students, will the results vary? Like if they surveyed 1,000 teenagers versus another 1,000, will those results vary? What do you think? Yes or no? Those results will totally vary. So that answer is yes, because data will vary. Is it a valid statistical question? Yes, because data will vary. And then the population in the sample. The population is the big overall group that they're trying to talk about. So who are they really talking about? Like, they surveyed 1,000 teenagers, right? I think it's easier personally to go find the sample. Like, that's the sample. That's who they surveyed, the 1,000 teenagers. Anything specific about those 1,000 teenagers, though? Were they all located in the same spot? Like, remember the bears we talked about last week? It was more specific. It was about grizzly bears in Alaska kind of stuff. So is there anything specific about these 1,000 teenagers? They're all from where? U.S., right? So it's not just teens across the world. So the population is all U.S. teenagers. All U.S. teenagers. Sorry, I made that small there about that. The population is all U.S. teenagers. That means then the sample is the 1,000 random teens surveyed. Random teens surveyed. And then what do you think? Is this an observational study or an experiment? Out of all 1,000 of them that they surveyed, did they treat them the same or did they treat them differently? They treated them the same. So you can circle that. That's an observational study, baby, because there was no treatments. Cool, man. So the homework is all of 4.1, a little bit of the new stuff, a little bit of the old stuff, and even a couple questions from the past. So let's have a good one.